Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is New York City Marxist Studies Collective, and we are in our fifth session of our study of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. Today is October 6th, 2023, and we have a special guest today. We have Dr. Gerald Horne is visiting us, and we'll begin our discussions today with his own thoughts and reflections on relevant topics. So I will be quiet for a while and pass it over to you, Dr. Horne.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. The bad news is that I'm going to speak about hundreds of years of history in about 35 minutes. The good news is that basically everything I discuss is reflected in books that I've written. So you can perhaps put a pin in certain points or dates and then go back and track it in the written word. Now, for convenience sake, I'll start in the middle of the 15th century, 1453 to be specific, when the Christians, so-called, are ousted from control of Constantinople, which of course is today's Istanbul. And it did appear that the Muslims who had executed this maneuver were on the march. After all, they had been controlling the Iberian Peninsula for hundreds of years, up until the other date, which is 1492, when not only Columbus sails the ocean blue, but the Muslims who had been under siege on the Iberian Peninsula for decades, if not centuries, are finally kind of pushed out, which leads to a final expulsion of their forces about a century later. That also marks an acceleration of the so-called Inquisition. That is to say, become Catholic or be subject to torture or execution, which fell heavily upon the Iberian Jewish population, and put a pin in that thought because we'll come back to it shortly. In any case, with Columbus's freebooting in the so-called New World, you saw the creation of a brand new power, speaking of Spain, based upon plunder and pillage, not least of the indigenous, and the acceleration of a process that had begun decades, if not centuries earlier, by various forces, speaking of the trafficking and enslaved Africans. But that leads to another key date, which is 1517, when there's the secession from the Catholic Church by the man we know as Martin Luther, which leads to the formation of the Protestant sect, so-called, which then takes London by storm by the 1530s. I'm sure you all know the story about Henry VIII and the stories about his so-called divorces, although the not-so-hidden agenda was that with his coming over to the Protestants, he was able to loot the Catholics of their wealth in the British Isles, and as he establishes this Protestant Anglican church, as it comes to be called. And that leads to a round robin of religious wars that course throughout the 16th century. The Protestants were disadvantaged. After all, the Catholics had a 1500-year head start in terms of corralling believers. And that leads inevitably to the point that as the Protestants are battling the Catholics, they stumble into a kind of militarized identity politics. I find it curious in 2023 that this term identity politics, and even identitarians, is oftentimes used by those who unwittingly, I assume it's unwittingly, or part of the process that led to this militarized identity politics, speaking of the construction of whiteness. That is to say, that the Protestants in an attempt to avoid being overrun. And after all, by 1588, they were almost overrun by Catholic Spain, and only certain wind gusts prevented that from happening. They engaged in a historic compromise. They had expelled their Jewish population at the end of the 13th century. But alas, in the 16th century, they decided that the better part of wisdom was to embrace the Jewish population, and their comrades in Holland do something similar, not to mention the forces of Islam in what is now Istanbul. But it's more than that. Also embraced were those who they had been warring in their backyard. English versus Irish, English versus Scot, English versus Welsh, eventually British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Austrian versus Hungarian, Serb versus Croat, Bulgarian versus Russian, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. All of a sudden, when they cross the Atlantic, they adopt this new identity known as whiteness, this sticky identity that's still with us today. And although there has been substantial scholarship on this point, alas, one of the ideological weaknesses of our friends on the left is that they oftentimes don't keep up with the scholarship. It reminds me, you know that saying, truth is beauty and beauty is truth. That's all you know and all you need to know. Well, most of these people on the left say, look, what I know now is all I need to know. I don't need to learn anything else. And so they're like biologists who say, well, Charles Darwin didn't talk about DNA, so why should I talk about DNA? I mean, it's really sort of ridiculous and ludicrous. In any case, this new construction is quite useful in terms of London playing catch-up ball. After all, the Spanish had established a settlement in St. Augustine, Florida in 1565. The Londoners did not arrive in North America into what they call Virginia until about 1607. And then, alas, through their ability to surge ahead with regard to the African slave trade, their ability in the 17th century to engage in a precursor of a bourgeois démarche by Oliver Cromwell executing the monarch, and during that brief period of so-called non-monarchist rule, they're able to oust the Spanish from Jamaica, which turns out to be a real cash cow in terms of the African slave trade's acceleration. Their comrades, the Dutch, were able temporarily during that same period to oust the Iberians speaking the Portuguese for a while from Brazil. And of course, when the Dutch had done so, they had made an entente with the Jewish population as well. But with the return of the inquisitors, speaking of the Iberians, the Jewish population was looking for a place to land. And of course, many of them wind up under the Union Jack, or what becomes the Union Jack, in the Caribbean. And this leads to the so-called sugar boom. Some call it the sugar revolution, which brings tremendous wealth pouring into the coffers of London, in the sense of that sugar was not only a way to sweeten your tea, but it was seen as a kind of miracle drug. And it had knock-on effects as well in terms of helping to forge a nation capitalism, insofar as it helps to give a shot of adrenaline to the boat building industry, with boats being used not only to transport settlers across the Atlantic to join those who had migrated to what is now called Virginia, what is now called Massachusetts, what is now called New England, but also to transport enslaved Africans, and of course to transport sugar as well. At the same time, London delivers what was thought to be a knockout blow to their fellow Protestants during that same time, although, of course, their fellow Protestants had established a toehold in what is now South Africa as early as 1562. London did not actually oust them from that strategic site until the beginning of the 19th century. But the writing was on the wall as early as the 17th century. And of course, the Dutch were not ousted from their other strategic site, which was Indonesia, until 1945. And of course, we can go into that in terms of how US imperialism, posing as an anti-colonialist, helps to push many Europeans out of their colonial sites, leading the naive to think that the US is an anti-colonial power, when actually they just wanted to elbow aside these competitors and curtail, if not end, imperial preference, which tied these colonies in a trade straitjacket to their colonial masters, which the United States was able to disrupt. In any case, as these processes were unfolding in the 17th century, you saw the formation of the Royal African Company, which marked an acceleration of the aforementioned African slave trade, which turns out to be one of the most lucrative businesses known to humankind. You could invest $1 and get $1,700 back. There are those today who would sell their firstborn for a 1,700% profit, not to mention some African they did not know. And as recent scholarship has instructed us, this leads directly to the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, whereby the merchants want a piece of the action. And that leads to the process in my 1776 book I call Free Trade in Africans, when there's a deregulation, so-called, of the African slave trade, and the Royal African Company monopoly is progressively withered, and hordes of merchants descend upon the African continent with the maniacal energy of crazed bees, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight, which leads to a acceleration of the number of free laborers in the Caribbean in particular, Jamaica, Barbados in particular. But of course, people do not want to work for free, particularly under the lash. And so it also leads to a round of slave revolts. And here is where Spain begins to try to make a comeback, because they're still stationed in St. Augustine, Florida. And they're still fixated on this idea of religion as a marker of society. Whereas with the rise of London, you see the progressive erosion of religion as a marker of society with, quote, race, unquote. Keep in mind, for example, that the colony we know as Maryland today was actually pioneered by English Catholics. The Spanish would not have allowed Protestants, who they did not recognize and they saw as devilish, as proceeding with settlements under the Spanish flag. In any case, what happens is that the Spanish, from their perch in St. Augustine, Florida, begin to try to stir up the Africans in neighboring South Carolina. That leads to one of the bloodiest slave revolts in the history of North America, Stoner's Revolt, South Carolina, 1739. Slave revolts in New York City, 1741, 1712. Also, the French Catholics. Of course, there was a French Protestant population, the French Huguenot population, which finds it difficult to come to an accommodation with the ruling Catholics, and many of them wind up under the Union Jack in South Carolina, or they wind up under the Dutch flag in South Africa. In fact, even though we oftentimes speak of the so-called Afrikaners in South Africa as being wholly of Dutch origin, actually it's a fusion of Dutch Protestants and French Huguenots. And in fact, if you go to certain cemeteries in South Carolina to this very day, you can see all the French Huguenot names on the tombstones. In any case, so the French are sponsoring the African revolts in New York, Spanish doing the same thing, Spanish sponsoring African revolts in South Carolina, New York. This leads to the so-called 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, and the English basically clear out and clean out these fellow enslavers and colonists, particularly the French from Quebec, although, as we know, that leaves a lingering national question of the Quebecois in Canada, and temporarily the Spanish from Florida. And of course, part of the process was this notion embodied in the so-called Royal Proclamation of 1762 that London would be loath to continue expending blood and treasure to oust the indigenous from their land so that land speculators like George Washington could profit. This creates a bone of contention between the settlers and London, not to mention that London, which after all has a contemporary population of only about 60 million, but was seeking to establish a worldwide empire that ultimately included the jewel and the crown, speaking of India, contemporary population of 1.3 billion, not to mention ultimately African colonies, ousting the British from Guyana, South America, the 19th century, etc. So they were becoming more dependent upon armed Africans to maintain their empire, which was like a red flag to the bull for many of the settlers, who even today get nervous when you talk about Negroes with guns, to quote the title of the book by the late Robert F. Williams. The confluence of these events leads to a settlers' revolt, not unlike, as I argue, the settlers' revolt that gripped what is now Zimbabwe in 1965, where in fact the Rhodesian Front said that they were walking in the footsteps of 1776. This has become a difficult lesson for many of our friends on the left to absorb, even though if you look at the literature, and I would point not only to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Indigenous Peoples' History in the United States, the recent book by Ned Blackhawk, The Rediscovery of America. And it's just been nominated for a National Book Award. And so when I mention in this context that sometimes the bourgeoisie of the United States is ideologically ahead of the left on certain questions, they're keeping up. They just nominated Blackhawk's book for a National Book Award. Some of our friends on the left, Horne, he's toadying after the bourgeoisie. He's praising the bourgeoisie. No, I'm not. I'm dissing y'all. That's what I'm actually doing for not keeping up with the literature and falling behind ideologically and historically. In any case, much of the recent literature points to, instead of these high-flown ideas, which obviously are coming to question as we stare down the barrel of fascism, these high-flown ideas of so-called freedom and liberty, they look more materially at land and labor as triggers for this formation of the United States of America. Surprise, surprise, even though in the late 18th century, there were tens of thousands of enslaved Africans. By 1860, there were millions, even though this is supposedly an anti-slavery abolitionist revolt. I'd hate to see a pro-slavery revolt with those numbers. And of course, even though with 13 colonies pinned on the Atlantic seaboard in the late 18th century, today it's stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, all the way out into the archipelago of Hawaii. Somehow that happened under the noses of these freedom-seeking settlers. In any case, a turning point comes with regard to anti-slavery with the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, which ignites a general crisis of the entire slave system, which can only be resolved with its collapse, despite the fact that those who purport to be in favor of workers' solidarity and workers' revolution somehow have totally overlooked the revolt of unpaid labor, which overthrew the oppressors and then came under unremitting pressure from supposedly this liberty-seeking regime in Washington, D.C., which oftentimes even collaborated with its antagonists in France to make sure that that regime was suffocated. Also, the so-called liberty-seeking settlers overthrew Mexican rule in Texas by 1836, again in 1846 to 1848. Interestingly enough, the three largest states in the United States today, Texas, California, and Florida, all used to be under the Spanish flag. In fact, Florida was under the Spanish flag longer than it's been under the US flag. In any case, the confluence of these tensions and contradictions, that is to say, land grabs from the indigenous, the Haitian Revolution, inspiring the unpaid sector of the working class in North America, leading to a growing abolitionist movement, which in the first instance compels London to move away from the slave trade by 1807, away from slavery by 1833, 1834, contributes to the US Civil War, which I'm happy to say, fortunately, leads to the abolition of slavery. But as Blackhawk and other historians have pointed out, we would be naively idealistic if we failed to understand how the US Civil War ultimately led to a disaster for the indigenous population, not least because they were able, that is to say, the settlers were able to recruit newly freed Africans into the Buffalo Soldiers to be the tip of the spear in waging war against the indigenous population post 1865. As I say in my book on Texas, in East Texas, the Negroes were being assaulted and lynched by the Ku Klux Klan. In West Texas, Negro soldiers in blue were routing and pulverizing the indigenous population. It was not a glorious chapter in Black history, to put it mildly. In any case, as the bourgeois historians have put it, the frontier closed by the 1890s. What they mean by that is that there had been a certain turning point in terms of the subjugation of indigenous nations, which allowed a nascent US imperialism to turn its attention to overthrowing the Hawaiian monarchy in the 1890s, waging war on the tottering Spanish Empire during the same decade, delivering a knockout blow to colonialism in what is called the Philippines and that archipelago, which of course leads once again to a bitter war, where once again you see Black soldiers weigh in on the side of Uncle Sam, and not to mention what happens on this side of the continent, where a similar process unfolds in Cuba and Puerto Rico, not to mention heading back out west towards Guam and other South Seas territories. In any case, what's happening simultaneously are contradictions emerging in Europe that we can go into if you're interested, leading to World War I, 1914 to 1918, which of course, one of the most significant results is the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which in some ways was instigated in part by another episode, which of course is the London financing of the Japanese attack on Russia in 1904 to 1905, which has knock-on effects that contribute to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. With the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, you see an attempt on the global scale to see a transition from religion, as enunciated a few moments ago, as embodied by the Spanish inquisitors, to race, which reaches a certain zenith, if not nadir, depending on your point of view, within the Anglosphere, to class as a major marker of society with the growth of socialism. Of course, many Black people in particular, not to mention Africans, particularly in South Africa, are attracted to the Bolshevik Revolution. And of course, in the United States, that leads to support for Black liberation as embodied in the Scottsboro case of the 1930s. If I had more time, I could go into more detail, or perhaps you can when I stop speaking in a few seconds. And, but as I've also pointed out, it would be a mistake to see Black internationalism as only embodied in the socialist project, because as historians have pointed out, and once again, our friends on the left I guess this is one of these inconvenient facts that they can't figure out where it fits, so they decide to just ignore it, which is that Tokyo probably had more adherents in the Black community pre-1945 than the socialists and communists did, which presented a Boulder-like problem for the United States when it got enmeshed in World War II. That is to say, when it got enmeshed in the Pacific War in particular, which led to many of these Black nationalists being interned, including Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam, the patron saint of that still existing organization. And of course, with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one of the major crimes against humanity in world history, that particular alliance between Black nationalists in Tokyo tended to die in the dust of Japan. But what helps to give it a comeback is that post-1945, you see the United States turn on this wartime ally, speaking of the Soviet Union, which it absorbed the brunt of the lances from the Nazis. Interestingly enough, as you probably know, we're having there's an attempt to reformulate that whole story. You saw it in the Canadian Parliament on September 22nd, 2023, where supposedly they didn't know that they were saluting a 98-year-old Nazi. It was a total accident. But actually, it's part of a kind of reformulation that's taking place as we speak, that if we're not careful is going to serve as an underpinnings for a unique form of US neo-fascism in the 21st century. In any case, post-1945, you see the rise of the Red Scare and the Cold War, which has a devastating impact worldwide, not least in the United States. I'm writing a book as we speak on its impact in Southern California. I'm always happy to talk about what I have not published. And this has ideological consequences as well, because with the attack on those espousing the socialist project, Robeson, Du Bois, I could raise my shirt and show you other names. This upsets the political ecosystem. It allows for the resurgence, recrudescence of those some had thought had been discredited pre-1945, speaking of the pro-Tokyo forces, which then adapt by moving away from seeing themselves as the avatars of being the Asiatic Black man to being avatars of Africa, as Africa is rising to independence. That's where you get the personification in Malcolm X, for example. So what happens is that as the United States is under pressure globally to move away from its hideous system of Jim Crow, US apartheid, not least because it wants to appeal to hearts and minds in Africa and the Caribbean surging to independence, this creates a dynamic that leads to the erosion of Jim Crow, although, of course, once again, as the liberals gain a certain kind of ideological hegemony, as those to their left are battered, many are forced to adapt liberal tropes and liberal analyses. And so therefore, the revolt against anti-Jim Crow is generally not accentuated. That is to say, Little Rock, 1957, Oxford, Mississippi, 1962, where people were slain, Boston, the so-called busing crisis of the 1970s, Yonkers, New York in the 1980s. Check out the movie Show Me a Hero, which deals with that, starring Oscar Isaac, one of our better actors. And so ultimately, this revolt against anti-Jim Crow, to skip over a lot of history, gets an embodiment by 2016 in the rise of Donald J. Trump. Now, one of the points that I have not mentioned thus far, but that should have been implicit in what I was saying, was that with regard to this settler colonial project, which is descended in North America, it basically involved class collaboration. As I say in my 16th century book, if you look at the first settlement in the Anglosphere in North America, in what we now call North Carolina, in the 1580s, it involved Europeans of various class backgrounds, all sponsored by the 1%. And certainly, if you look at the liquidation of the Native Americans, particularly in the southeast quadrant of North America, where the Cherokees used to rule, you fundamentally, you saw Cherokees who tried to adapt and assimilate, up to and including enslaving Africans, for example. They still had to go. And oftentimes moving into their mansions were European settlers right off the boat. And so perhaps from a crude materialistic point of view, it's understandable why there would be this 21st century revolt in the settler regime. I also find it curious that in terms of the United States not keeping up, those of you who are familiar with Australian history, which of course is another settler regime, know that fundamentally across ideological lines in Australia, and of course there's a very important referendum coming up this month with regard to Indigenous rights, but it's difficult to start any public meeting in Australia without a land acknowledgement. For example, if say I'm here in Texas, here we're sitting on the unceded land of the Comanches, blah, 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 blah. Hey, even people on the left in the United States, they'll do land acknowledgements. People on the right in Australia. Now, of course, if you do that, they say, oh, Horne is tailing up to the right in Australia. No, I'm dissing y'all. That's what I'm doing. In any case, to wrap up this tour of the horizon, in 2023, we're facing a distinct prospect of a rise of a unique form of U.S. neo-fascism. It's not comforting to realize that there was such a defenestration of the left in previous decades that recreating the anti-fascist alliance of the 1930s and the 1940s, which after all helped to defeat fascism then, will not be easy in North America. And my political tradition tells me I should always end on an upbeat note. But since I find myself oftentimes addressing Black audiences, I feel I can't deceive them. I got to tell them, hey, you folks, you may want to get out of Dodge, basically, because these polls that suggest that this 4 times indicted thrifter facing 91 felony charges could wind up in the White House within a year or so, you should take those polls very seriously. But more than that, you should have an analysis that helps to explain how we got to this point, more so than just sort of, throwing spitballs and saying, oh, Trump is terrible. I would go, fine. Can we stipulate that Trump is terrible, as the lawyers say, and then move on to an analysis? I'll stop here and take your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne. Yeah, everybody's muted, so you can't hear them, but they're clapping.
Thanks, Gerald. Oh my God, wonderful, wonderful, spectacular. I don't know if I could have. I've learned so much in that little 35 minutes. So, you covered a lot of ground. Particularly, I didn't know about the Japanese or Tokyo influence in Harlem. And I wanted you to sort of touch on Niger and sort of looking at African independence around the world and making that connection.
Mm-hmm. Well, with regard to the Japanese influence in Harlem and Black communities, that's in my book, Facing the Rising Sun. As I point out, that title comes from the Negro National Anthem, which includes the line, facing the rising sun. And as I've said in the book, you have to be a coincidence theorist. Got a lot of coincidence there. People in the United States, they always talk about conspiracy theorists. Got a lot of coincidence theorists. In the United States. Everything is a coincidence.
Yeah.
Right.
Everything is a coincidence. It's all accidents.
Yeah.
This is the accidental republic. Nothing proceeds according to plan. Everything just sort of happened. And anyway, I talk about that alliance in my book. Now, with regard to Niger, I'm on record with regard to Niger. You can find my comments since the regime change of July 2023 on the Activist News Network. I've commented on it quite a bit, sometimes twice a week since July 2023. But to make a long story short, what happened is that French neocolonialism has been quite successful in its neo-empire in Africa in bludgeoning and battering civilian forces who are trying to overthrow French neocolonialism and trying to redistribute the wealth, be it Sama Sankara in Burkina Faso, Modibo Keita in Mali, for example, the destabilization of the regime of Sekou Ahmed Toure in Guinea-Conakry. After all, coming to independence in 1959, 1960, the French, they took the typewriters, they took the light bulbs, they even wrecked the toilets, to make sure that the regime would get off on the wrong foot. And so it sort of devolved to the military, which oftentimes includes working class elements. Now, let me say, before my many critics accuse me of being in favor of coups, I'm not in favor of coups, but I am against French neocolonialism. And as I interpret what's going on in Niger and in Mali and in Burkina, which are now in an anti-Paris alliance, assisted, by the way, by Algeria, which has decided to become an intermediary. And of course, my book that I'm writing right now, it begins in Algiers in 1971. Excuse this digression. When Kathleen Cleaver and Donald Cox, field marshals of the Black Panther Party, are meeting with Czech diplomats at the Czech embassy in Algeria, arranging for a cache of weapons to be shipped to North America for use by the Black Panther Party. In any case, so the
Those were the days.
Sorry?
I just said those were the days.
Those were the days, my friend. I thought they'd never end. But unfortunately, I was wrong. But in any case, now Gabon, you have to put in another category. Gabon seems to be a kind of palace coup with the Bongo dynasty of 56
Definitely,
years, big overturn. The new leader is a property owner in Hyattsville, Maryland, and Silver Spring, Maryland, for example. As a matter of fact, as I hinted a few moments ago, Gabon, and in fact, what's happening in Africa today, you see that the post-Suez crisis of 1956, recall when Israel, Britain, and France attacked Egypt over control of the Suez Canal and were forced to back down, not only by Moscow, but by Uncle Sam, President Eisenhower. And so Britain decided that the jig was up. It had to tie its apron strings closer to those of Uncle Sam. French took a differing point of view. They had to develop more independently. That perception was concretized when the rising Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy started criticizing the French war in Algeria, which eventuated in independence in 1962. As I said, the naive thought that he was an anti-colonialist, but actually he was trying to elbow aside France so that U.S. imperialism could assert itself. And you see a similar process taking place, perhaps even in Niger, I'm afraid to say, because even though the Niamey authorities have asked the French ambassador to evacuate, the U.S., which has had difficulty posting ambassadors in sites all over the world, parachuted an ambassador into Niamey in the last few weeks. And of course, the French base in Niger has come under assault. The U.S. drone base has gotten a pass thus far. So once again, our friends on the left, I know that in theory, their theory tells them they should always be studying and trying to keep up with the developments. But oftentimes, as I said, it's like the poet who says, beauty is truth, truth is beauty. That's all you know, and that's all you need to know. They think that I know all I need to know. I don't need to keep up with events. What are you talking about?
Yep.
Do you think how do you relate the Gabon coup against the Bongo dynasty to the Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso coups in recent years and until this year. Like, is that a coincidence, as you were, or that because I do agree with you that there's a different character, even though Bongo needed to go for a long time. How do you relate just the timing of this, the fact that this happened now?
Well, there have been a lot of unrest in Gabon,
For a
which
long time, yeah.
has a small population of about 3 million, although it's a major oil producer. And, just like the old saying, when Bill Gates and Elon Musk walk into the bar, the average income of the bar
Right.
goes up. And so
I use
because
that
of
all
all
the
this
time. Yeah.
oil wealth, there's this perception that the masses in Gabon are doing quite well, but it's the Bongos who are doing quite well.
Right.
And so the new leader is a relative of Bongo, the current Bongo. In fact, on French media, they were touting the prospect that actually some of the deposed Bongo's relatives were in on the coup, up to and including his wife, who of course is a French national, or a French origin, I should say. I'm not so sure about that, but that's what French media was reporting for a while. In any case, as I said, I don't really see the events in Gabon as being in the same character as events due north. The French don't seem to be that disconcerted by the events in Gabon, which is usually a telltale sign. Look at the hysterical reaction with regard to Burkina and Mali, Niger, for example. So, as I said, we'll have to just keep an eye, because these situations tend to be very fluid. Oftentimes, they can change. What I'm saying today could change. And, there was an attempted coup in Burkina just a few days ago against the de facto leader. And supposedly it failed, and the coup plotters are, quote, on the run, unquote. So these are very fluid situations and very fragile societies. And of course, I would be remiss if I failed to point out this other factor that's relevant in Burkina, Mali, and Niger, which is the religious zealots, who are still a major factor in all of these countries. And as I've said in some of my media appearances, don't rule out the possibility of the North Atlantic countries trying to cut a deal with the religious zealots, even though they're supposedly public enemy number 2, I guess, behind China and Russia, because they're so upset with the fact that Niger has upset the uranium deals for France, and it's upset this deal of Nigeria building a pipeline through Niger to Morocco to pump natural gas into Europe to compensate for boycotting Russian natural gas as a result of the Ukraine crisis. So, as I said, these situations are very fluid, and we shouldn't go too far out on a limb with regard to any of them.
I want to ask if anybody else has any questions. And while people are thinking of them, why don't you go ahead, Sheila?
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is quite amazing. I'm sure we will be listening to this lecture over and over again. But I'm wondering, Dr. Horne, if you could comment about Ukraine and what you think of that, and also the left, the U.S. left, sort of supporting the war, actually, and the prospect of world war with Russia and China, and within the United States, if you could say something about the case of the African People's Socialist Party. Thank you.
With regard to the African People's Socialist Party, as you know, a number of their leaders are under indictment right now, including Chairman O'Malley, supposedly for consorting with the Ruskies. Once again, on the Activist News Network, I have a number of commentaries about that case. And in fact, let's see, tomorrow's on October 28th. I do these interviews on the Pacifica station in Los Angeles, kpfk.org, Freedom Now, 11 a.m. Pacific. I've already taped an interview with their cadre that will run on October 28th, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, as a prelude to their march on the White House on November 4th, I believe. So tune in. In any case, with regard to Ukraine, I have a piece in this latest book that will drop in a few days called I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader. And in that book, I have a piece on the crisis in Ukraine that was written shortly after February 2022, when the crisis took on a new character. And I tried to put it in a wider context, and which, once again, has been painfully absent from many analyses, including our friends on the left. I guess they don't know that much history. Don't know much about history. In any case, I point out that for hundreds of years, there's been this fundamental contradiction in European history. That is to say, the smaller, less populous Western European nations, Britain, France, the Iberians, had garnered tremendous wealth through plundering of the Americas and Africa, and had become world powers. But they were not necessarily the most powerful force in their backyard, on their continent, which leads to repeated efforts to resolve this contradiction, going back to Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with the 1812 overture, to the Crimea War of the 1850s, where Britain, France, and Turkey gang up against Russia, and actually bloody Russia's nose, to be frank with you. You may be familiar with Lord Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade and some of the literature coming out of that bloody conflict. I've already mentioned London financing the Japanese attack on Russia, 1904, 1905. I did not mention Operation Barbarossa, at least not explicitly, in June 22nd, 1941. And the problem for these North Atlantic countries is that Russia is the largest country by territory, not only in Europe, but worldwide, a storehouse of natural resources, not only the natural gas, which is in competition with US natural gas as we speak because of the boycott by the North Atlantic powers, but diamonds, resources necessary for the green economy, et cetera. And so I guess you can make an argument, once again, that the North Atlantic powers sort of stumbled into this war, that as some bourgeois analysts used to say about the British Empire, it proceeded through absence of mind. They just sort of stumbled into running India, they stumbled into running Sri Lanka, they stumbled into running a good deal of Africa. And so by creating this North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 1949, on an anti-Soviet basis, or as they used to say, keep the Germans down and the Russians out and the US in. And then 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, but, in absence of mind, they just keep expanding. I mean, they're not really thinking about this too clearly, I guess. But then the inevitable happens. And the problem, of course, is that their analysts didn't think things through. What I mean is, so they had cut this deal with China, which, of course, the bourgeois analysts celebrate as being this master stroke of diplomacy, Nixon going to China. Of course, it led to massive direct foreign investment in China, which has now created this juggernaut. If you look at my speech on C-SPAN, I won the American Book Award for my 16th century book. I drew an analogy between the rise of London and the way we were speaking English today and the rise of China in terms of these for lack of a better term, misstrokes by competitive powers, be it Spain in the 16th century or the United States in the 20th century. And so now what's happening, you're having this global reorientation from Russia after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, now moving closer to China. Now, the bourgeois analysts, they keep telling us, oh, that won't last. After all, when the Western European nations were moving west to plunder the Americas and south to plunder Africa, Russia was moving east. Vladivostok, established in 1860, 1861, oftentimes they're moving east at the expense of Asian nations, including China. But it's amazing how being under the gun can forge alliances. It's no secret that in terms of this putative split that you see in Washington right now over Ukraine funding, the right wing, my friends on the left, they're telling me, you know, we need to cut a deal with the right wing. Since we're against the war, they're against the war. What could go wrong? I said, well, yeah, sure. They want to cut a deal with Russia so they can focus like a laser beam on China, where for various reasons, the Democrats have overreached. That's one of our advantages in dealing with this bourgeoisie. Oftentimes they overreach. That's what happened during the Civil War, which is why I'm not being sold on the open market anymore. They overreached. They overestimated their strength and their potency and wound up losing it all. Billions of dollars in property. They still haven't recovered from that, for example. So I say all that to say that we may be in an inflection point with regard to the global correlation of forces. You even see this with regard to this loose talk about what the United States is going to do with this estimated, now underline estimated $300 billion in Russian assets. That is to say, whether they should just, you know, turn it over to Zelensky. Now, of course, even talk about that is leading to China, you know, rethinking its purchase of U.S. Treasury bills, for example. Look at there. I think it was in the New York Times today. There was an article about the debt servicing of the debt because, you know, they have to offer more in terms of. I don't think since 2011 there has been a net increase in Chinese purchases of U.S. Treasury bills, for example. Arabs are thinking the same way. The Saudis, despite all this talk about this new alliance between the United States, Israel, and the Saudis, et cetera. So the contradictions are such that even talking about certain things, like plundering this Russian 300 billion, is having these tremendous knock-on effects that obviously, once again, these folks in Washington have not thought through the consequences. Once I said, you know, maybe they're overestimating their strength. I could go on in this vein, but that would take time away from your comments and questions since we only have about 6 minutes left.
Dr. Horne, I wanted to, I guess, sort of, if you can tie up the Chinese African presence in Africa, the U.S. China, what's their alternative? I heard recently that China's going to bring in their immigrants and then have second generation babies that are going to be presidents and kings of New Africa.
Oh,
and how does that tie into, you know, Black people catching hell all over the world for the last 1,000 years? How do we, what's the solution in terms of reparation and moving forward as a coalition?
Well, let me begin by talking about a man I was talking about quite a bit in late July, early August 2023, Jean Ping, who had been the major challenger to the Bongo dynasty in Gabon. He's half Chinese. His father's Chinese. But, you know, excuse my impertinence, but part of the good news about many of our Black brothers and sisters is they're not really keeping up. So if they had known about John Ping, they would have been freaking out. You know, say, oh, there it is. You know, whoops, there it is. You know, but interestingly enough, let me begin by saying that during the time of the Entente between China and the United States, beginning in the 70s to the 80s, I was quite critical of Chinese foreign policy. It's on the record. You know, I mean, all you have to do is look at what I was writing. I wrote quite a bit in the 70s, 80s. I was quite critical of that. But, you know, conditions change, I change. And so now China's under the gun. Now African nations look to China as a counterweight to US imperialism and North Atlantic imperialism. When Vice President Harris flew into Ghana, Zambia, and Tanzania, every airport she landed in Accra, Lusaka, and Dar es Salaam, were either designed or built by Chinese interests. That is to say that it's no secret that Chinese interests are interested in what's in the ground, be it oil or lithium, for example, in Zimbabwe. But unlike the North Atlantic countries, at least they're leaving infrastructure behind. As I've said more than once, if the United States accomplishes its dream of overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party tomorrow, there'll still be these airports there. There'll still be the railway from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, from Mombasa to Nairobi. There'll still be the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. There'll still be the beginnings of this highway from Cape to Cairo, for example, which has been a dream going back even before Cecil Rhodes, the British colonialist. So as of now, I'm supportive of the African nations with regard to their attempt to develop a counterweight to North Atlantic imperialism by brokering deals with China. Now, of course, there are going to be contradictions. China has a thriving private sector, despite the fact that the Communist Party has political hegemony. That does not necessarily mean that a Chinese private sector interest is going to be acting in a benign fashion overseas. But you know, it's just like some of our friends on the left. When the Soviet Union was in existence, they didn't like the Soviet Union. Okay, fine. Now you have the BRICS. They don't like the BRICS. I mean, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. You know, as one of these leftists said, you know, they're all accumulating dollars. So what's the difference? They're all, you know, imperialists. So what's the difference? Interestingly enough, coincidentally enough, once again, coincidentally enough, somehow they always wind up in a position that's supportive of US imperialism, be it pre-1991 or post-1991. But some of us cannot afford that kind of ideological luxury. Some of us are in day-to-day battles with imperialism. We're not in an ivory tower pontificating. We're trying to analyze the present correlation of forces and develop powerful blocks to challenge imperialism. We recognize that within these powerful blocks, there can be heterogeneous forces that, believe it or not, everybody will not necessarily agree with me. The question is, do we have some sort of bottom line agreement that moves in an anti-imperialist direction? So I will conclude on that point at 5 p.m. Eastern US time.
Thank you again, Dr. Horne.
Excellent, thank you.
Hey, send me the link.
I will. Okay.
Absolutely, positively will. We'll
right.
definitely stay in touch with you.
All right, good luck to you.
All
Yep.
right.
Yep.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
We'll look forward to hearing from you on YouTube.
Right on.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.